Ghana revokes 701 diplomatic and service passports in unprecedented crackdown on abuse of state privileges. Welcome to the Bold African Voice, BAV, where truth meets courage and Africa speaks boldly. I'm Abdul Karim Kargbo, born and raised in Africa. Today, we uncover one of Ghana's most decisive anti-privilege actions, the cancellation of 701 diplomatic and service passports. What does this mean for Ghana's democracy, and how should the rest of Africa respond? Stay with us for an in-depth analysis that goes beyond the headlines. In a landmark decision underscoring Ghana's renewed efforts toward accountability and transparency, the government has revoked 701 diplomatic and service passports held by former state officials, political elites, and business figures. This sweeping action follows the expiration of a January 24, 2025, deadline set by President Nana Akufo-Addo's administration for the return of these passports, as outlined in a directive to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The move is part of a broader attempt to reassert control over the issuance and use of official travel documents, and to eliminate systemic misuse tied to privilege, patronage, and corruption. Critical analysis: the rationale behind Ghana's decision. The cancellation of such a large number of diplomatic and service passports is rare and signals several important developments. 1. State reassertion of authority. This marks a significant shift in Ghana's bureaucratic governance, where public office privileges have historically extended beyond tenure. The government's decision to annul passports held by individuals no longer serving in official capacities demonstrates a move to dismantle informal networks of privilege. 2. National security and integrity of travel documents. Diplomatic passports confer international privileges and immunities. When misused by individuals with no current official role, they pose risks to national security and the credibility of Ghana's diplomatic engagements. The Foreign Ministry's action is a preemptive compliance measure with international travel norms and ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization, guidelines. 3. Legal backing. The reference to Sections 6 and 7 of the Passport and Travel Certificates Act, 1967, NLCD 155, provides a legal anchor for this decision. These sections outline the circumstances under which passports may be issued, retained, or revoked, reinforcing the government's stance within the rule of law. Breakdown of affected categories. The 701 passports revoked span a broad spectrum of Ghana's political and social elite. Former ministers and their spouses, ex-members of Parliament and Council of State retired judges, superior and lower courts, former regional and local government heads officials of the National Cathedral Project businessmen, traditional and religious leaders, non-career ambassadors, and board members. The inclusion of religious and traditional leaders, some of whom wield substantial influence, underscores the boldness of the directive. Africa-wide comparison: how other countries handle diplomatic passport abuse. Ghana's action invites a broader comparative analysis across Africa, where the misuse of diplomatic passports is a common, often unaddressed governance issue. Nigeria. In 2017, the Nigerian Immigration Service announced it would revoke diplomatic passports from former public office holders who no longer qualified. However, implementation remains weak, with anecdotal evidence of continued abuse by ex-politicians and their families. Sierra Leone. In 2018, the newly elected government under President Julius Maada Bio invalidated hundreds of service and diplomatic passports issued during the previous administration. However, follow-up enforcement was opaque, and the issue resurfaced in successive administrations. Kenya. The Directorate of Immigration Services occasionally revokes diplomatic passports, but these actions are often ad hoc, politically motivated, or quietly reversed. South Africa. The Department of Home Affairs applies stringent conditions, limiting diplomatic passports strictly to those on official duties. The country also maintains an automated database that flags misuse. Ghana's centralized and public approach to enforcement, anchored by a presidential directive and foreign ministry compliance, appears more institutionalized than ad hoc efforts elsewhere. Forward-looking implications for Ghana. This passport revocation marks a watershed moment in administrative reform. Key forward-looking outcomes could include 1. Enhanced border and immigration systems. The decision may lead to the digitization of Ghana's diplomatic passport database, integrating it with international systems to ensure real-time validation. 2. Policy reform on passport issuance. A new legislative or regulatory framework may emerge, mandating stricter eligibility criteria, periodic renewals, and biometric tracking of diplomatic and service passport holders. 3. Regional leadership role. Ghana's bold action could inspire ECOWAS members to adopt similar accountability measures, particularly amid rising cross-border security threats and regional instability. 4. Reputational capital. Internationally, Ghana's proactive governance could boost its standing in terms of diplomatic integrity, especially ahead of global engagement such as the African Union summits and UN General Assembly sessions. Latest developments and reactions. According to the Ghanaian Times and statements released by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, January 27, 2025, a total of 810 passports, 407 diplomatic, and 403 service were returned voluntarily before the deadline. Those who complied include high-profile former ministers and judges. However, some notable absentees have raised eyebrows, hinting at possible resistance or political tensions. Opposition figures have criticized the move as a targeted political cleanup, though the government maintains the action is rooted in legal obligations and not political retaliation. Civil society groups such as the Ghana Integrity Initiative, GII, and Imani Africa have lauded the decision as long overdue, emphasizing the cost and reputational damage caused by widespread abuse of diplomatic passports. Meanwhile, regional diplomats and embassies in Accra have reportedly welcomed the development, citing it as a best practice model for documentation integrity. Political fallout and institutional power play. The mass invalidation of diplomatic and service passports is unfolding against the backdrop of Ghana's politically charged environment, where perceptions of selective enforcement and political victimization can spark significant tension. While the Office of the President has stressed that the measure applies uniformly and across party lines, critics argue the initiative disproportionately affects individuals associated with previous administrations or dissenting institutions. Some opposition-aligned former ministers and members of parliament have reportedly challenged the move in public discourse, framing it as a subtle attempt to disempower and delegitimize influential voices outside the current executive's control. Legal analysts caution that Ghana's judiciary could soon face petitions challenging the scope or fairness of the revocations, particularly if any passport holder can demonstrate ongoing state-related functions or unjust denial of rights under NLCD 155. At the heart of this tension lies a broader institutional power play, the rebalancing of executive dominance over bureaucratic legacy structures. The presidency's directive, while administrative on its face, reflects a deeper resolve to dismantle entrenched networks that often extend their influence beyond their official mandates. This is a critical step in reinforcing the doctrine of temporality of state privilege, which asserts that government benefits, especially those with international implications, must end with public service. Diplomatic integrity and international cooperation. From a foreign policy perspective, the government's decision may boost confidence among diplomatic partners and multilateral institutions. In recent years, several reports, including internal memoranda by Ghana's own foreign missions, have cited instances where holders of diplomatic passports engaged in activities that either embarrassed the state or compromised bilateral relations. For example, in 2023, Ghanaian diplomatic passport holders were involved in a controversial business delegation visit to a European country that resulted in customs breaches and media backlash. Investigations later revealed that several individuals on that mission held no formal ties to the government at the time of travel. By tightening the reins on eligibility and insisting on the return of passports, Ghana is aligning its practice with global standards. Under the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, 1961, diplomatic privileges are tied explicitly to active assignments. Any extended use of diplomatic documentation beyond tenure erodes credibility and risks state liability. Ghana's move can thus be viewed as part of a regional shift toward normalized diplomatic protocols, especially as ECOWAS and the African Union continue to push for greater continental integration, harmonize border security, and enhance credibility in external engagements. Digital governance and future enforcement mechanisms. Looking ahead, this passport cleanup may serve as the launchpad for broader digital governance reforms. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Regional Integration is reportedly exploring a centralized biometric registry for diplomatic passport holders, linked to both the Ghana Immigration Service and the National Identification Authority, NIA. Such integration would allow real-time status validation of passport holders, immediate deactivation of passports upon role termination, automated alerts for expired or ineligible usage attempts at ports of entry, auditable trails of diplomatic travel for transparency. These measures would dramatically reduce human discretion in passport issuance and revocation, a major concern raised in past audits. In fact, a 2021 internal audit report cited inconsistencies in the recording and tracking of diplomatic passports, including delays in deactivating expired ones and overlaps in issuance between ministries and regional offices. Implementing a blockchain-based passport issuance system, similar to what Estonia and Rwanda have piloted, could further reduce fraud and ensure strict eligibility adherence. Lessons for African states. The need for unified frameworks. Ghana's crackdown on unauthorized use of diplomatic passports shines a spotlight on a structural weakness shared by many African nations: the lack of standardized, continent-wide eligibility criteria and enforcement mechanisms for official travel documents. While AU protocols outline diplomatic protocol for engagements at continental events, they stop short of enforcing internal governance practices. A comparative analysis reveals Botswana has one of the most transparent diplomatic passport registries, with all official recipients published in a government gazette. Ethiopia limits its diplomatic passports strictly to cabinet-level ministers and their direct delegations, with annual audits. Cameroon has faced repeated allegations of misuse, with reports in 2022 suggesting that over 40% of diplomatic passports were held by individuals with no valid government affiliation. Uganda witnessed a diplomatic scandal in 2021 when forged service passports were traced to a network operating within the Ministry of Internal Affairs. What is lacking is an AU-level directive that harmonizes definitions of eligibility, travel privileges, and security protocols for diplomatic documents across all member states. Such a framework would promote mutual respect and integrity in diplomatic interactions, curb illicit financial flows and cross-border misconduct, facilitate law enforcement cooperation in cases of abuse, improve the overall image of African diplomacy in global forums, the human dimension, political elites, privilege, and public perception. While the government's move is being lauded by governance reform advocates, The human and political impact is already beginning to ripple across the elite class in Ghana. For many former ministers, judges, and traditional leaders, the revocation of diplomatic and service passports represents more than a bureaucratic inconvenience. It is a symbolic stripping of privilege and status. In West African political culture, the ability to travel internationally with special clearance often serves as an unspoken marker of relevance and power. Sources close to several affected individuals report that some are privately furious, particularly those who claim they were never officially notified of the recall or believe they are still entitled to the documents due to ongoing advisory roles or political party affiliations. Legal advisors to a handful of former public officials are reportedly reviewing the recall to determine whether it can be challenged on procedural grounds, citing ambiguity around what constitutes currently serving in any official capacity. There are also whispers of brewing internal discontent within the ruling New Patriotic Party, NPP, with some of its elder statesmen who are now without diplomatic privileges, questioning the political cost of such an uncompromising stance ahead of the next elections. While President Akufo-Addo has framed the move as a commitment to state reform, detractors within his party worry that alienating former loyalists could fracture the party's support base. Meanwhile, civil society and sections of the media are closely watching for signs of selective enforcement. Will the same rigor be applied to influential business people with close ties to the current administration? Will any exemptions be quietly granted behind closed doors? These are questions that could determine whether this reform is viewed as a genuine institutional reset or a calculated power realignment. Impact on the National Cathedral project and faith-based diplomacy. Among the groups named in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs revocation list are officials connected to the controversial National Cathedral project, a religious infrastructure initiative spearheaded by the Akufo-Addo government and funded partially through public and private resources. The project has faced sustained criticism over cost overruns, lack of transparency, and the perception of preferential treatment in public procurement. Some of the individuals whose passports were revoked reportedly acted as international envoys or fundraising emissaries under the banner of the project, securing foreign donations and attending global faith conferences. With their passports now invalid, questions arise as to how the project will maintain its international engagements and whether new appointments will be made to replace the now ineligible envoys. More broadly, this could signal a subtle distancing by the government from the project itself, especially as public scrutiny continues to mount. The implications extend beyond Ghana. Many African nations, including Nigeria, Uganda, and Kenya, have increasingly incorporated faith-based diplomacy into their foreign policy toolkits, leveraging religious leaders and institutions to build soft power. Ghana's passport reform may prompt a recalibration of how religious actors are officially sanctioned to operate across borders. Public opinion and media response. The Ghanaian public has responded with a mix of approval, curiosity, and cynicism. Social media platforms like X, formerly Twitter, and Facebook have seen the hashtags passport purge, diplomatic reset, and accountability inaction trend intermittently. Commentators are divided between praising the government's commitment to reform and accusing it of performative politics in the twilight of the Akufo-Addo presidency. Editorials in major publications, including the Daily Graphic and the Ghanaian Times, have cautiously endorsed the decision but called for greater transparency in future passport issuance. Several radio and television talk shows have featured former diplomats and public servants expressing both support and concern over the sweeping nature of the directive. Meanwhile, international observers, particularly donor partners and diplomatic missions, are reportedly taking note. Ghana's reputation as a stable democracy with a functioning civil service has often given it a leadership role in ECOWAS and AU initiatives. This latest step could either bolster that perception or raise questions if implementation turns out to be uneven or politically biased. Implications for upcoming electoral dynamics. As Ghana prepares for its next general elections in 2028, actions such as this passport recall could become flashpoints in political debates. The opposition, led by the National Democratic Congress, NDC, may use the controversy to accuse the NPP of undermining political pluralism or of consolidating power under the guise of reform. This move may also affect the political calculus of patronage networks. In a political system where rewards are often distributed through appointments, access, and travel privileges, the recall could shake the expectations of upcoming political aspirants and reshape how loyalty is cultivated within party structures. Moreover, the revocation creates a precedent that any future administration may feel compelled to uphold or reverse. If the next government were to reissue these passports indiscriminately, it would not only undermine the current administration's reform agenda, but also invite public backlash and accusations of hypocrisy. Global accountability frameworks and Ghana's compliance obligations. Ghana's mass recall of diplomatic and service passports does not exist in isolation. It intersects with the country's broader international obligations under several transparency and anti-corruption frameworks, most notably the Open Government Partnership, OGP, the African Peer Review Mechanism, APRM, and the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, UNCAC. Under the OGP, to which Ghana became a signatory in 2011, governments are expected to increase transparency, empower citizens, fight corruption, and harness new technologies to strengthen governance. A key component of this is the elimination of state capture networks, including the misuse of official documentation and credentials for private or political gain. The 2025 passport purge, when fully implemented with transparency and oversight, may serve as a tangible benchmark for Ghana's OGP deliverables during its next reporting cycle. Similarly, the APRM, a continental self-monitoring mechanism that promotes good governance among African Union member states, emphasizes the need for rationalization of public privileges, equitable access to state resources, and ethical public service conduct. Ghana's action could earn commendation during its next APRM country review, but only if it is coupled with a commitment to transparency in reissuing new passports strictly based on eligibility. The UNCAC, which Ghana ratified in 2007, also obliges signatories to prevent corruption in public administration and to promote integrity, accountability, and proper management of public affairs and public property. Misuse of diplomatic passports, especially when linked to abuse of office or patronage networks, falls within the scope of administrative corruption under the Convention. This move by the Ghanaian government thus strengthens its compliance credentials ahead of future UNCAC review sessions, risks and gaps, challenges in enforcement, and public trust. Despite the seemingly decisive nature of the directive, significant challenges remain in enforcement. For instance, there is limited public knowledge of the monitoring mechanisms that will ensure compliance by individuals whose passports have been invalidated but may still attempt to use them at points of departure. According to a source within the Ghana Immigration Service, GIS, airport officials have not yet received real-time digital verification tools that can automatically flag canceled diplomatic documents. Until such systems are deployed, there is a risk that some revoked passports could still be used, especially at less secure border crossings or with the aid of compromised officials. Another concern is the lack of a publicly accessible audit trail of all revoked, returned, and reissued passports. While the Ministry of Foreign Affairs released figures indicating that 810 passports had been returned as of the January deadline, there is no detailed breakdown of these returns by category, nor is there a commitment to publish a final audit report. The absence of such transparency may lead to distrust among civil society actors, especially if suspicions of preferential treatment begin to circulate. Furthermore, discretionary exemptions, if granted without clear public justification, could further erode the legitimacy of the process. For example, should certain former government advisors or business elites with strong political connections retain or regain diplomatic passports, this could send conflicting signals about the true intent of the reform. Technology, reform, and regional influence. The long-term success of Ghana's diplomatic passport reform hinges on its ability to modernize state document governance through technology. Integrating biometric verification, blockchain authentication, and centralized digital registries will be crucial for sustaining the integrity of the passport system. Ghana can draw lessons from Rwanda's e-governance model, where passport issuance and eligibility are tightly controlled through a real-time digital interface connected to national identification and immigration systems. Similarly, Mauritius operates a secure electronic passport registry where revocations and renewals are instantly updated across all ports of entry. If Ghana is able to institutionalize such a model, it could serve as a regional hub for passport integrity and offer technical assistance to countries within the ECOWAS bloc. This would enhance cross-border cooperation, reduce fraud, and build a more trustworthy diplomatic network across West Africa. Moreover, Ghana's initiative could become the basis for a regional policy proposal, perhaps tabled through the ECOWAS Council of Ministers, that advocates for harmonized diplomatic passport standards, shared verification systems, and periodic audits across member states. What the revocation means for institutional memory and the role of retired public servants. One often overlooked dimension of the passport recall is its impact on institutional memory. Many of the individuals whose diplomatic or service passports have been revoked, former justices, MPs, council members, and ambassadors, possess years of governance experience. Though retired, they continue to represent valuable assets in Ghana's informal policy network, often called upon to lend expertise, mediate political crises, or represent the country at international forums. With their passports now invalid, some of these roles may be curtailed or become less practical, particularly for those living abroad or engaged in regional consultative bodies. If the government fails to establish transparent protocols for reissuing travel privileges to such individuals in a controlled manner, Ghana may lose an important cadre of diplomatic elders. A balance must be struck between eliminating misuse of state documents and maintaining access for legitimate post-service representation. The key lies in creating a clearly defined and public eligibility mechanism, perhaps a vetted advisory council or registry for retired officials on national assignments, backed by fixed-term passport authorizations, revocable at any time. Historical context: the evolution of diplomatic privilege in Ghana. To fully grasp the significance of the 2025 passport recall, one must explore the historical trajectory of how diplomatic and service passports evolved in Ghana, from instruments of foreign policy to tools of domestic privilege and political reward. During the Rawlings era, 1981-2001, diplomatic passports were strictly controlled. Only individuals with active, verifiable roles in international diplomacy or regional engagement were issued such documents. However, as Ghana transitioned into a more pluralistic, democratic framework in the early 2000s, and as subsequent administrations sought to consolidate political loyalty, diplomatic and service passports began to be distributed more liberally. By the time of the Kufuor administration, 2001-2009, it became increasingly common for high-ranking officials, business allies, and political appointees to receive diplomatic passports as a symbol of elite status, even if their duties did not warrant such classification under international norms. The Mills and Mahama governments continued the practice, though with varying degrees of discretion. Under President Nana Akufo-Addo, the proliferation escalated to new levels, particularly during his first term, 2017 to 2021, when numerous appointees, relatives of officials, traditional leaders, and board members of government agencies were issued service or diplomatic passports, sometimes without clear justification. The cumulative effect was a dilution of the passport's credibility and an increased risk of misuse, including international embarrassment. Indeed, reports from foreign missions and customs authorities in Europe and North America began to flag concerns about Ghanaian diplomatic passport holders involved in unauthorized commercial ventures, overstaying travel periods, or bypassing standard airport procedures without diplomatic mandates. These incidents embarrassed Ghana's foreign ministry and likely triggered internal reviews that culminated in the 2025 policy shift. The rise of the parallel economy of privilege. What Ghana is now confronting is the legacy of what some governance analysts call a parallel economy of privilege, an informal system in which access to state-issued documents, titles, and perks becomes part of a political patronage economy. In this system, diplomatic passports confer not only travel convenience, but access to duty-free imports, visa-free movement, and elevated social status. Service passports are often used by non-state actors with close links to power, such as contractors, religious emissaries, and favored consultants, to bypass bureaucratic constraints or access overseas opportunities. Appointments to government boards or commissions, even if ceremonial, are sometimes awarded not for merit, but to justify issuing a passport or accessing state protocol privileges. This ecosystem erodes state legitimacy because it blurs the line between public service and private gain. The passport recall is a direct attempt to disrupt this ecosystem, but it will require further steps, such as the overhaul of appointment protocols, audit trails for benefits attached to non-career positions, and public education on the limits of state privilege. Comparative examples across Africa demonstrate the challenge of breaking this cycle. In Angola, diplomatic passports were frequently issued to political families and foreign business intermediaries during the Dos Santos era. In Guinea-Bissau, a 2019 investigation revealed dozens of diplomatic passports issued to suspected drug traffickers, leading to diplomatic frictions with ECOWAS states. In all these cases, revocation efforts were either sporadic or reversed due to political pushback. Ghana, therefore, has a rare opportunity to set a precedent for systematic dismantling of privilege inflation through coordinated state action, digital transparency, and legal enforcement. Reactions from the diaspora and development partners. One of the more consequential aspects of the passport revocation is its reverberation across the Ghanaian diaspora. Several diaspora-based figures, particularly former appointees, trade attachés, and non-career ambassadors, have expressed frustration that their passports were annulled without personalized notification or clarification of their post-service status. For diaspora professionals who act as informal liaisons for Ghana's development or who serve in UN-affiliated roles, the inability to travel on official documentation can impede advocacy, fundraising, or international negotiation work. If the government does not create a clear process for temporary reauthorization for specific engagements, this could weaken Ghana's soft power abroad. On the flip side, development partners such as the EU delegation, the US Embassy, and the UK High Commission in Accra have welcomed the move, citing it as a strong sign of Ghana's commitment to state accountability and rule of law. Diplomatic sources suggest that Ghana's action may be referenced in future governance reports submitted to multilateral institutions such as the World Bank and the African Development Bank. It also positions Ghana favorably in discussions around African passport integrity, particularly at a time when several regional bodies, including the African Union, are exploring the rollout of a continental e-passport system. Ghana's leadership on internal reform could influence the adoption of shared standards. Civil society's role in sustaining reform momentum. With the initial policy enacted, the burden now shifts to civil society organizations, CSOs, governance think tanks, and investigative journalists to ensure sustained implementation and prevent quiet reversals. Groups such as the Ghana Center for Democratic Development, CDD Ghana, and Imani Africa have already issued calls for full publication of the number of passports revoked by category clear eligibility guidelines for any future reissuance, a third-party audit of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs passport registry, a legal review of how diplomatic passport issuance intersects with appointments in parastatal bodies. These interventions are critical because reforms often lose momentum once public attention shifts. Without sustained pressure, backroom deals, silent reinstatements, and abuse of discretionary exemptions could reestablish the same flawed system. Media houses, too, have a duty to continue covering the outcomes of this policy, not just the initial announcement. Investigative series into how passports were historically issued, who benefited, and whether legal action is being taken against documented abuses could deepen public understanding and accountability. Case studies of passport misuse, from diplomacy to embarrassment. To appreciate the full scope of the abuse and the justification behind the 2025 recall, it is essential to examine specific case studies that reflect how Ghana's diplomatic and service passports were used in ways that compromise state integrity, foreign relations, or public trust. Case Study 1, The Business Delegation Scandal in Europe, 2023. In late 2023, a Ghanaian delegation, purportedly on a trade and investment mission to Germany, became the center of international scrutiny after multiple members of the team were found attempting to import undeclared luxury items using diplomatic clearance. Investigations later revealed that several individuals on the trip were private businessmen and board members of local authorities who held service passports but had no official status or government endorsement for international engagement. The German authorities, embarrassed by the diplomatic oversight, filed a complaint with Ghana's embassy in Berlin. The incident reportedly contributed to a temporary suspension of expedited visa processing privileges for Ghanaian diplomatic passport holders in the Schengen region. This event triggered an internal memo within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs calling for an urgent audit of all special passport holders traveling without ministry clearance. Case Study 2, Diplomatic Passport Linked to a Fraud Syndicate, 2021. In 2021, Ghana's national security apparatus uncovered a complex real estate fraud syndicate operating out of Accra with suspected links to foreign financiers. One of the arrested suspects, found to be a key negotiator in high-profile property transactions, possessed a diplomatic passport issued under the guise of serving as a special advisor to a subcommittee on housing reform, a title that held no formal cabinet or statutory weight. The suspect had used the passport to facilitate multiple international trips, where fictitious partnerships and fraudulent documentation were presented to foreign investors. This case not only exposed weaknesses in passport issuance protocols, but also raised alarms about the intersection of corruption, impersonation, and document abuse within state systems. Case Study 3, Traditional Leaders' Detention in Dubai, 2019. A well-known traditional ruler from Ghana's eastern region was detained in Dubai in 2019 for attempting to access a diplomatic lounge using an expired diplomatic passport. Airport officials, unable to verify the validity of the document through Ghana's consular system, flagged the matter to Emirati authorities. After a brief detention and diplomatic intervention, the chief was released, but the embarrassment made international headlines. It was later discovered that the diplomatic passport had been issued during a previous administration as part of a cultural diplomacy initiative that lacked clearly defined operational limits. The fallout from the event led to informal restrictions on Ghanaian diplomatic passport holders' access to certain airport services in the Gulf region. Legal ramifications and the path toward institutional reform. These case studies illustrate the legal gray zones that had developed around Ghana's diplomatic passport regime. In most instances, the abuse was made possible not through criminal hacking or forgery, but through bureaucratic complacency, informal appointments, or loosely defined state functions that made verification difficult. The legal underpinning of the 2025 revocation relies heavily on the Passport and Travel Certificate Act, 1967, NLCD 155, particularly Sections 6 and 7, which outline the categories of persons eligible for diplomatic and service passports, the discretionary power of the Minister of Foreign Affairs to issue, deny, or revoke such documents, the requirement for all such passports to be returned upon cessation of official duties. Legal scholars, however, argue that the statute, while functional, is outdated and lacks the specificity required in the age of digital identity and complex interagency governance. There is growing momentum within legal circles for a comprehensive overhaul of Ghana's passport laws, including statutory timelines for automatic expiration of diplomatic passports tied to term limits or contract duration, mandatory clearance from both the appointing agency and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs before issuance penalties for institutions or individuals that fail to retrieve passports from former officials' cultural shifts, reframing public service and status. Beneath the policy, legal, and administrative layers lies a deeper cultural issue: the entrenchment of status and entitlement within Ghanaian public life. For decades, the possession of a diplomatic passport has been viewed not merely as a tool of duty, but as a symbol of arrival, an identity marker conferring respect, influence, and convenience. Public servants who retire often expect to retain some of these symbols of prestige, even in the absence of ongoing responsibilities. In such a context, revoking diplomatic passports can feel to some like a public demotion or even a personal affront. This perception complicates reform efforts, as entitlement culture pushes back against systems that seek to align privilege strictly with duty. Shifting this culture requires more than enforcement. It demands re education, leadership by example, and symbolic gestures from the top. For example, the president and ministers could voluntarily return or renew their own diplomatic passports annually based on active duty. Former high officials who comply early with revocation directives could be publicly commended to model civic responsibility. Civil society could launch awareness campaigns about the difference between service and entitlement in a modern democracy. Only by reframing the narrative around public service can the state reclaim its symbols of authority and restore credibility to instruments such as diplomatic passports. Toward regional convergence, ECOWAS, AU, and the future of diplomatic travel integrity. Ghana's unprecedented passport revocation initiative has laid the groundwork for what could become a continental policy conversation on the regulation, standardization, and ethical management of diplomatic privileges. Within the ECOWAS framework, there is currently no binding protocol that governs the issuance, renewal, or revocation of diplomatic and service passports. While the ECOWAS travel certificate facilitates free movement among citizens of member states, It does not address the abuse of elevated state documents used to bypass immigration scrutiny or evade customs controls. Ghana's leadership on this matter opens the door to a new proposal at the regional level: the creation of an ECOWAS Diplomatic Travel Integrity Charter, a centralized regional registry of diplomatic passport holders maintained by a secure digital database, accessible by member states, a peer review mechanism under the ECOWAS authority of heads of state, enabling countries to audit each other's diplomatic passport regimes, clear criteria for granting or withdrawing privileges, and a system to flag discrepancies across jurisdictions. Similarly, the African Union can draw on Ghana's model to initiate a continental policy directive, ensuring all AU member states define and enforce the limits of diplomatic privilege based on internationally accepted standards, particularly those set out under the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, 1961. Such regional efforts would restore trust in the African diplomatic community, eliminate parallel economies of state privilege, enhance cross-border security and migration governance, project a unified, responsible Africa on the global stage, advice to African leaders, reclaiming the state from privilege. Capture Ghana's bold move is a lesson for all African governments. The abuse of diplomatic and service passports is merely a symptom of a deeper governance pathology: the personalization of the state and the institutionalization of privilege. To reverse this trend, African leaders must: 1. Audit and cleanse all forms of state-issued privileges, including diplomatic passports, government vehicles, special waivers, and protocol access. 2. Digitize government registries to allow for real-time status checks, expiry tracking, and transparent eligibility records. 3. Link diplomatic travel authorizations to measurable duties, not honorary titles or party loyalty. 4. Institutionalize accountability through publicly accessible audits and civil society oversight of state document issuance. 5. Lead by example. Presidents, ministers, judges, and party officials should voluntarily relinquish expired state benefits and communicate that public office is about service, not status. 6. Educate the public on the value of clean governance and the cost of allowing access to state instruments to become symbols of impunity. Ultimately, diplomatic documents represent the face of the state abroad. If they are devalued at home through abuse or complacency, no amount of foreign policy diplomacy can restore the nation's image. Summary of key messages. Ghana has revoked 701 diplomatic and service passports due to widespread misuse, sending a strong signal on restoring governance integrity. The revocation affects former ministers, judges, business people, and religious leaders no longer serving in official capacity. The move aligns with Ghana's commitments under the Open Government Partnership, OGP, UNCAC, and the African Peer Review Mechanism, APRM. Historical misuse cases highlight how privilege was weaponized through informal networks of power and patronage. Ghana's decision could become a model for ECOWAS and AU-wide passport reform frameworks. Cultural change, not just policy, will be necessary to end the cycle of entitlement in public service. African leaders must act boldly to dismantle the systems of symbolic privilege that erode the credibility of governance and justice. Thank you for watching The Bold African Voice, BAV, amplifying the stories that shape our continent. If you find this report insightful, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Hit the bell so you never miss a bold take on Africa's most pressing issues. Until next time, remember, in the new Africa we're building, accountability is the highest privilege.